Okay. So let me just, before I answer Bill's question, let me just say that the portion this week is Pinchas, and it is on page 918 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, that is in this one. Otherwise, look in whatever edition of Chumash or Bible you have. We're looking for the book of Numbers, chapter 25, verse 10. Or if you have a Chumash, then you're just looking for Pinchas in the table of contents in the book of Numbers. So Bill asked a question in the chat. He's listening in an audiobook to Robert Alter. Robert Alter, who's an English professor at University of California, Berkeley, became famous in the Jewish world, not just because he's Jewish, but because of writing a book when I was in rabbinical school called The Art of Biblical Narrative. It's I'm turning to my right to see if I can see it quickly on my shelf, and it's not sticking out at me. I know it's on my shelf. I just don't see it right now. Anyway, it's a thin paperback book that explains how the Bible, according to a scholarly perspective, how the Bible came to be, and how what different strands of authorship are, and things like that, and certain styles that you find throughout the Bible. And then he started working on translations of each of the books of the Jewish Bible, to the point where last year he came out with, he finished translating the entire, as he was translating, certain volumes came out. So I have several of those individual volumes. Now it's a whole 3-volume set on the translation of the Bible. So Bill asks that before each chapter, let me just let in somebody else. Before each chapter, he discusses how the book came about, who wrote them, who compiled them, and did I learn this in rabbinical school? And yes, we did learn this in rabbinical school. The Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the main rabbinical school for the conservative movement, was very much focused on authorship of the Bible. Preeminent Bible scholars have taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. H.L. Ginsburg is one name that comes to mind from the 40s and the 50s. Ed Greenstein was my main Bible professor, who made Aliyah and teaches in Israel now. A number of big name Bible scholars have taught at the seminary. So yes, the focus of Bible study at the seminary is a combination of the scholarship, that is seeing the Bible for a piece of literature, and at the same time understanding the religious history that is associated with the book as well. So it's both. It's not just the scholarship who wrote the Bible that the seminary Bible classes taught, but it's who wrote the Bible, but also what the midrash, what the rabbinic commentary has to say too. So with that in mind, the portion Pinchas always falls at this point in the Jewish calendar. So that is, there are several portions that are associated with particular dates in the calendar, like ending the book ending the entire Torah on the holiday of Simchat Torah. The book of Deuteronomy always is read on the Shabbat right before the fast day known as Tisha B'Av. So that, according to the rabbis, it always has to fall on that day. And so 3 weeks before is the 2 weeks before is the portion Pinchas. And so Pinchas begins what is the period known as the 3 weeks in the Jewish calendar. So there's a fast day, the 17th of Tammuz, the 17th of the month of Tammuz, which we are in today, is the 16th of Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av. So the 9th day of Av is 3 weeks after the 17th of Tammuz. So the 17th of Tammuz marks the breaking of the wall of the city of Jerusalem, and 3 weeks later marks the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So it took 3 weeks for the Romans to get around to destroying the temple. And the same with the tradition has the Babylonians did the same thing with the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. So you have the fast day, the 17th of Tammuz, to mark the breaching of the wall, and the 9th of Av marking the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So Pinchas is always read at around this time. It's only a freak of the Jewish calendar if there are times that Pinchas will fall before the 17th of Tammuz. And if that's the case, then next week's portion, Matot, next week it's a double portion, Matot and Maseh, to conclude the book of Numbers. In those years when Pinchas is before the 17th of Tammuz, then Matot and Maseh are read separately. So it's just the technicalities of the Jewish calendar, that the theme of the year, in which we're at this point trying to religiously trying to understand why the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, what we had to do with it. That is, according to the rabbis, it's the Jewish community's fault that the Babylonians were able to destroy the temple, that the Romans were able to destroy the temple. In other words, for the rabbis, why would God let anyone destroy God's house? It must be to teach a lesson to God's people, the Jewish people. And according to the rabbis, the lesson is our transgressions. What were the sins that we were committing that caused the temple to be destroyed? Were we zealous enough in our observance of the commandments or not? Did we care about other people in the community or not? And so for the rabbis, sinat chinam, that is random acts of hatred, as opposed to random acts of love, random acts of hatred that were just nasty to other people, or at least not nice to other people, that's why the temple was destroyed. Or some would argue that the temple was destroyed because we didn't fight for our rights as an autonomous Jewish community. We should have fought the Romans instead of giving in. And so that sense of, I don't want to get into the element, all the ins and outs of Jewish history 2,000 years ago, but it's that sense of zealotry that connects to this portion Pinchas. Because we have to look at the end of last week's portion, the end of the portion Balak, to understand what the portion Pinchas is about. So let's turn back to page 908 in our Chumash, and Barbara, your daughter, is now joining. 908 in the Eitz Chaim, hi, Jan. So we're just, I want people to turn to page 908 in the Eitz Chaim, or Numbers chapter 25, beginning with verse 6. So just then, so there was a plague. Okay, let's start with at the beginning of chapter 25 on 907. So beginning of chapter 25 of the book of Numbers, page 907, Eitz Chaim. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women, who invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. Invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. Not exactly an invitation. There was an orgy going on, and Israelite men were saying, hey, that looks like fun. We're going to take part. Okay, so there wasn't like a gold embossed invitation that went out from the Moabite people to the Israelite people. This orgy was going on. The people partook of them and worshiped that God. They partook of those sacrifices. They participated with the Moabites, and they worshiped. So they did what the sex orgies apparently were part of pagan practice, and that's what was happening there. Thus, Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, and the Lord was incensed with Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord, so that the Lord's wrath may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's officials, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. Okay, so there's this incredibly violent punishment that God commands Moses to inflict on the men who are participating in this Moabite sex orgy. Just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, remembering the command to impale, taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. It's unclear if it's the belly or if that is the Torah's way of being less graphic. You know, in other words, like, oh, what we tell our little children, oh, there's a baby in mommy's belly, instead of saying, oh, there's a baby in the womb, and then having a kid say, oh, what's a womb? And I get into all those questions about how do babies happen, mommy and daddy? So this is the Torah's way of saying it's not the belly. It's the, remember, it's a sex orgy that is happening, so that's where the spearing took place. He followed the Israelite into the chamber, stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. So 24, this is how last week's portion ended. And you may wonder why I didn't talk about that on Shabbat morning while I was reading Torah. It doesn't exactly make for a good Shabbos discussion. But 24,000 people died in this plague because of this pagan practice that was taking place, and it stopped because Pinchas, remember, God's command was impale all the people who are involved in this orgy. And so Moses says, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. We don't know if the men actually did that, followed through on Moses' command. We know that Pinchas did it. So now, turn ahead to page 918, the story continues. That was Numbers 25, verse 9, is how last week's portion ended. It's just random that the rabbis decided to break the portion here. So the chapter, to break the chapter here. So the chapter continues. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me And that word for passion in Hebrew is kin'ah, bekano et kin'ati. And that kin'ah is also zealotry. So the passion is a zealous behavior. Okay, so it's not, passion can be applied to a number of activities, right? He's passionate about his work. She's passionate about about this. He's passionate about that. It can be applied to any number of things. But if a particular kind of passion is zealotry, and so the better translation here, I would argue, is zealotry. So zealotry is being passionate for a religious cause. Okay, so Pinchas was zealous for God. So he heard Moses's command, impale the people who were involved. Pinchas does that. He impales a couple, an Israelite man and a pagan woman. You would imagine, even though the Torah presents it in a PG format, the real format was, while they were engaged in the act, Pinchas impales them. And God likes that, according to the Torah, and that's how the plague stops. So he turned back to verse 11. Pinchas has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. So not only was Pinchas zealous, but the same word for passion is described to God also, that God is zealous. So this raises a lot of questions, because at least for moderns, and that is, how do we know how to be zealous, and are we right to be zealous in a particular way? In other words, are we as Jews today supposed to act like Pinchas? And if Jews today were to act like Pinchas, what would make us different from ISIS? What would make us different from anybody else who acts passionately or zealously in the name of their religious convictions, right? And the further question is, the further complicating factor of this question is that for the Torah, it seems that Pinchas is acting on God's command. Today, when people act zealously in God's name, we can't prove that God spoke to them. In other words, I want to go, I'm using the extreme example of ISIS to teach this point. Those terrorists who took over the planes on 9/11 yelled, Allahu Akbar, God is great, before committing that heinous crime, that violent crime in God's name. So they claim that God told them to do that. Pinchas claims, and it's corroborated by the narrative of the Torah, Pinchas claims that he was acting in God's name. And so the question is this the way we're supposed to act? And the rest of the Bible has stories of prophets, of people who act zealously in God's name. You have 2,000 years ago, an actual branch of the Jewish community, a group in the Jewish community known as the Sicarii. They were the dagger bearers. They were the zealots in the Jewish community at the time who claimed we need to act violently in God's name to save our lives. We need to kill Romans. So the rabbis at the time said, no, the majority of the rabbis said, no, we are not following the Sikari in the community. There were individual rabbis who thought that the Jewish community should follow the Zealots, but the majority of the rabbis said no. So the question is, if Pinchas is in the Torah, and this act of zealotry is in the Torah, why aren't we acting zealous today? So before I answer the question, and there's a lengthy commentary below the line, let's just go on in the English. So verse 12, say therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. And I don't know why the English translates this as friendship, because the Hebrew is my pact of peace. Lachein emor hineni noten lo et briti shalom. And it's translated, grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, the same word there, zealotry for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites. Now, the below the line commentary will point out something that the Hebrew here does not point out. But if we were looking at the Torah scroll, we would see the Yud in Pinchas's name in verse 11. The Yud already is a small letter, but in the Torah scroll, the Yud is written even smaller than usual. So let's say the Torah scroll is written in 12-point font. The Yud would be in 10 or 8-point font. Okay, so if you are a sofer, if you are a scribe writing the Torah, when you get to verse 11, for the word Pinchas, you'd have to make that Yud smaller. Also, the Vav in the word Shalom, the last word of verse 12, which is translated as friendship, which we know means peace, the Vav in Shalom, it looks like a spear. Take a look at it in your edition. The letter Vav itself doesn't take much imagination to say, oh, that if I use my imagination a little bit, it looks like it could be a spear, especially the bottom of the Vav, depending on the font you use for Hebrew, the calligraphy font for a Vav has in the Eitz Chaim, you'd have to take your glasses off, put up a magnifying glass and see that the bottom of the Vav is on a diagonal. It's on a diagonal. It's not a straight line on the bottom. It's a diagonal. So that diagonal means it's pointed, and it looks like it could be a spear. In the Torah scroll, that Vav is broken in half. Instead of a straight line for the Vav, there's a separation in it. So now, with that in mind, why is there a small Yud in Pinchas's name in verse 11? Why is the Vav broken when it's written in the Torah scroll? So it's not a mistake by the scribe. It's not like he ran out of ink and then had to dip the quill into ink again to finish the Vav. No, every single Torah scroll in the world, if that Vav is not written that way, it's not a kosher Torah scroll. It has to be written that way. So it's not a mistake. It's intentional for that Vav to be broken. So now let's take a look at the commentary below the line and answer this question about what the Torah is trying to teach us about zealotry, or how to rein in zealotry, and how do we deal with this person, Pinchas. We should know from Jewish history too. So Pinchas is Aaron's grandson, and Eleazar, Aaron's son Eleazar, is the high priest at the time that we're talking about here in the desert. When Eleazar dies, Pinchas will become the high priest. Okay, so this zealot becomes the high priest. So he's the high priest when Joshua takes over and they enter the land of Israel. And it's Pinchas' son Eli who makes an appearance in the story that is the Haftarah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, when Hannah goes to pray for a child. It's Eli who is the high priest. That's Pinchas' son. So it's either his son or his grandson. So that's the line of high priest. So Pinchas, even with this act of zealotry, becomes a high priest of the community. So Pinchas, I'm below the line now. Pinchas killed an Israelite man and Moabite woman because their flagrant immorality profaned God's name. The Torah seems to approve of Pinchas's extreme act. Some modern as well as ancient commentators follow suit. Okay, so on the one hand, saying Pinchas is a hero, there should be more Pinchases, and if there had been more Pinchases, we as a Jewish community would be better off. Okay, so even before I start reading, I continue reading, just want to say that there are those who would say the Sikari in the Jewish community against Rome 2,000 years ago, if all the Jews followed the Sikari, maybe the temple wouldn't have been destroyed. If the Jews in Europe during the Crusades only had the wherewithal to fight the Crusades, maybe there would have been less destruction and slaughter in the Jewish community. If there were more Warsaw Ghetto uprisers, maybe there would have been less people killed in the Holocaust. That's what this argument is saying. We need, in other words, commentators throughout history, talking from the ghetto when we as Jews did not have any rights at all to stand up to the sovereign non-Jewish authority. Commentators suggesting, perhaps wishing, if only we could be, and we could promote Pinchas as the example to follow. So thus Hirsch, that's Samson Raphael Hirsch from 150 years ago in Germany, an Orthodox rabbi. For example, anyone who wages war on the enemies of what is good and true is a champion of the covenant of peace on earth while engaged in war. So that paradox, that if you're fighting in God's name, and the act of fighting is war, so that's violence, you are fighting for peace and goodness. So there's that paradox that Hirsch is saying, by being a zealot, which involves violence, that is okay as long as it's in the name of peace and goodness, which opens a whole can of worms, because whose peace and goodness, whose definition are we talking about, right? And in other words, the Torah has a particular slant and teaching us a particular lesson. For the rabbis, this is God talking. And so what happens in the Torah is based on what God says happened and wants to happen. But today, no one in the Jewish community, from the ultra-Orthodox to the ultra-liberal, no one claims to talk in God's name. And so to declare to an act of war against those who are evil, to say that we are doing that in God's name, nobody would ever do that. However, Pinchas, this story claims that it is permissible to do so, and not only permissible, God commands it, right? So now there's another author from 150 years ago, 130 years ago, the Chatam Sofer, praises Pinchas for showing the same zeal and energy to do right that the sinning Israelites displayed in doing wrong. Right? So the sinning Israelites were involved in sexual immorality and this sexual orgy. So that was zealotry in the name of evil, and Pinchas was zealotry in the name of good. Chatam Sofer, by the way, is known for his major book on gossip and slander, and that is, if we can guard our speech zealously, I guess he would say, then we would bring good to the world. So you have a couple of commentators that the editor here of our Chumash claim present, and I'm sure there are more who present how Pinchas is great and there should be more Pinchases. But the next paragraph, most post-biblical commentators, however, tend to be uncomfortable with the zealous vigilantism of Pinchas, criticizing his fanaticism as a dangerous precedent. The Talmud claims that had Pinchas asked the rabbinical court if it was permitted to kill Zimri and Cosby, citing halacha to justify his request, the court would have told him the law may permit it, but we do not follow that law. And it's from the Talmud tractate Sanhedrin, the tractate that deals with courts of law and issues that would come to courts of law. So fascinating that in the Talmud itself, so in other words, the Talmud takes all the laws that are presented in the Torah, like observing Shabbat, as a matter of Jewish law and a real case. Like the Talmud presents, if someone violates Shabbat publicly, then one has the right to bring that violator of Shabbat to court to be punished. And Shabbat, we would imagine, let me say it this way, we would imagine court to be involved with laws that involve cases between people. So those commandments that are bein adam la'adam, between one person and another person. We don't expect court to be involved with cases that involve between person and God, bein adam la'makom. So Shabbat, what does Shabbat have to do with anything? Whether I keep Shabbat or not, what does it have to do with any of you? How have I affected your civil rights in any way? So what place is there for court to get involved in violations of laws that deal with people and God? So Shabbat, observing Shabbat is something God commands us. Not stealing, God commands us that also, but not stealing, and I'm picking on Howard now because on my screen, Howard is to my left. So if I steal something from Howard, then yes, that could be brought to court. But if I violate Shabbat, how have I impacted Howard in any way? For the Talmud, yes, religious law, laws that affect our relationship, our personal relationship to God, are should just as well be dealt with in court as stealing and business law and things like that. Okay, so what they are saying is, if Pinchas were the high priest at the rabbi's time and the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, and Pinchas did this act on his own, the Sanhedrin would have acted against him and brought him into court and punished him for acting on his own. And what it's saying, if Pinchas, let's say, so Zimri and Cosby, they're named in verses 14 and 15, which we didn't read. But if we look on page 919, the name of the Israelite who was killed, the one who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, son of Salu, chieftain of the Shimon ancestral house. The name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosby, daughter of Tsur. He was the tribal head of an ancestral house in Midian. Okay, so the commentary didn't make up these names. The Torah has these names. So it's Zimri and Cosby. So in other words, the Sanhedrin, the law was, okay, now I have a case of sexual immorality that's happening in front of my eyes. What am I supposed to do? According to the Talmud, you get a Beit Din together, get some rabbis together and say, hey, what are we supposed to do here? There's sexual immorality coming. So Pinchas, instead of acting in the moment with the spear, should have said, hold on a second. before I impale you with this spear, let me just run to the Sanhedrin and see if I'm allowed to impale you with the spear. So, I was going to say, so continue on, but no, they shouldn't be continuing on because they're involved in sexual immorality. Hold right there, don't move. I'm just going to run to the Sanhedrin and see what they tell me to do. I'll be right back. So so you see how unrealistic that is. But the Talmud, in discussing laws like this that appear in the Torah, frequently, I wouldn't say just exceptionally, frequently say, even though the Torah says we can do this, we, rabbis, say we do not do this. So even though the Torah says you can execute people, and it gives manners of execution for what crimes people should be executed for, the same tractate Sanhedrin says, if we execute one person in 70 years, we're considered a bloody court. Okay? So that despite the fact that Jews weren't autonomous in their time to even handle capital crime, the Talmud is saying we don't do that. The Torah says, and this is in the book of Deuteronomy, if there's a rebellious child, you can bring the rebellious child to the elders at the gate, and the elders can execute that rebellious child. The Talmud says, even though the Torah says that, we don't do that. The Torah says, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Even though the Torah says that, the rabbis say, we say that means the value of an eye for the value of a tooth. Okay, so 3 examples of several examples in the Torah in which the rabbis say, yes, this act of zealotry was here in this particular case. Had Pinchas come to us, we would have told Pinchas, do not impale that couple. We don't act that way. Okay? So that is then the rabbinic attitude towards violence in God's name is quite tempered. So now it goes on after those parentheses. Moses of Coucy is a town in France. He was even though I've never heard of Moses of Coucy before, he is a well-known rabbi from the 1300s in France. I know this because of, I tell you, you know the teacher is good if you remember something the teacher taught 35 years ago. So one of my halacha professors was David Galinkin in my year in Israel in rabbinical school, 85, 86, right? So that's 35 years ago. He taught about, back then, about whether we can eat rice and beans on Passover. And Moses of Coucy is a prominent rabbi in that discussion about whether you can eat rice or beans on Passover. The bottom line is Sephardic Jews say have always said it's okay. Ashkenazic Jews have said no, it's not okay, because cooking rice and beans, the way you cook it, it looks like chametz, and so because it looks like chametz, you can't eat it just to be on the safe side. And sometimes grain gets mixed in with the rice and beans too. So anyway, I just remember that Moses of Coucy played a prominent role in that discussion. And so for me, Moses of Coucy is a well-known rabbi. So he notes that although the previous parsha ends with Pinchas's deed and the death of 24,000 Israelites, Pinchas's reward is not proclaimed until the beginning of this parsha, which is interesting, right? So why did the rabbis separate the story and have us hang on for a week until we read what happens to Pinchas, right? Last Shabbos morning, portion ended with Pinchas impaling them, and then the plague of 24,000 people dying. And now we have to wait until the next week to see what happens to Pinchas. This teaches us, the commentary continues, to never rush to reward extremism. We are to wait until later events clarify whether the zealot's intention was indeed pure. So that's fascinating too, right? So in other words, it says a lot about how we're supposed to act in the, we apply this not to acts of zealotry, but to acts of social justice, right? So Rosa Parks, was Rosa Parks supposed to wait for somebody to tell her? Like, should the NAACP or the or whatever Reverend Martin Luther King, whatever organization he was from, should she have called them up and said, you know what, I'm thinking, I really don't want to move to the back of the bus. I want to sit on the front of the bus. Would her message have been so effective if she had called ahead of time and called a meeting and then had her be designated by the whole civil rights movement to sit on the front of the bus? Or was it more effective because in the moment she decided to do that, right? So I only mean to compare Rosa Parks to Pinchas in just the magic of acting in the moment. And there is some important work and moments in history that have happened because of people acting in the moment and not calling a meeting first. And so I would argue that for social justice, if you're not using violence, then acting for social justice, acting in a moment, is purely acceptable. Nobody's getting hurt. You're just taking a stand. And so what are the rabbis saying here? Are they saying that we prefer committee meetings all the time before any act of spontaneous individual action is to happen? Or are we saying, okay, you can act spontaneously if you're acting in the law non-violently, but if violence is going to be involved, then we need to call a committee meeting? Yeah, Jan, you can unmute yourself.
So my thought is, don't we always believe that there is the opportunity for a tshuva, right? We can do whatever kind of mistakes, and we can work through to try to be forgiven and get back on the right track.
Yes.
So a punishment where you take somebody's life away, you're also taking away their ability to perform tshuva and kind of redeem themselves in that way.
Right.
So I was wondering, did Pinchas get the smaller yud because when he took that action, it was like he had a little less godliness in him, a little less prophetic or priestly judgment in him, because sometimes like the yud, it stands for God. So right. Smaller yud, because in that moment when he did that action, a little less God in him because he took away the opportunity for a tshuva for those two folks.
Right. Okay, so that's a fascinating point, Jan, and it's an important point. And in fact, if we're going to read in the next paragraph, we will have just enough time to do that. It'll give a slightly different explanation for why there's a smaller yud there. But yes, the idea of when we act violently, individually, in a vigilante way, yes, we take away the other party's attempt at teshuvah. So, which is to highlight this point, the rabbis teach about, yes, execution is an acceptable Jewish form of punishment, but the rabbis add conditions. So let's say, I'm picking on Howard again because he's to my left. Let's say I see Howard I'll put it in the time of the rabbis, with a knife in his hand. And it's clear that and Barbara on my screen, Jan, your mother, Barbara is right underneath Howard. So Howard has a knife in his hand, and it is absolutely clear without a shadow of a doubt. And if all of you on this screen were to see Howard with a knife in his hand, it would be absolutely clear that he's about to stab Barbara. Okay? And the point is, I'm just saying, imagine this. Barbara's on the ground, looking like trying to get away from Howard. Howard is after her with a knife. If I come upon this scene, what is my responsibility here? My responsibility here would ideally be to have Dennis, now he's to my right on my screen, be with me so that he and I are two, and let's say I have Jan too. So it's me and two witnesses telling Howard in a strict formulaic way, Howard, and I would have his full name, Howard Rummerman, or his Hebrew name, and I don't remember your Hebrew name offhand, but I would say that, your Hebrew name, please know that your action, you are about to murder someone. You should know that what you're doing will result in you being executed. So there's a warning that has to take place, so that despite that warning, if Howard continues on in his action and commits murder, then the court will have no choice but to execute him, because all those conditions were there. I gave the warning. If I didn't give a warning, then Howard would not be executed. He's still punished by God for murdering, but the court is not going to be punishing Howard for murdering. If I didn't have, there weren't other witnesses, it was just me. So there are all these factors here, but the issue is, as Jan is saying, there has to be an opportunity for remorse, or an opportunity for the person to say, yes, I am fully cognizant of what I am doing. And despite the fact that it goes against Jewish law, I'm doing it anyway. So that element of teshuvah there, so it's not just teshuvah, it's an awareness of of one's consequences. And Pinchas did not give Zimri and Cosby a chance to express remorse. Like Pinchas, as a priest, would say, "Hey guys, you're going against Israelite law here," and then Cosby and Zimri could have said, "Oh yeah, sorry, I just got caught up in the heat of the moment," right? But Pinchas didn't do that. Instead, wham, with the spear. So now, what does that? So then now the next paragraph, based on what Jan's saying, maybe the yud is smaller because he wasn't acting in his priestly religious way by giving people the opportunity to do teshuvah. In the text of the Torah scroll, the letter yud in Pinchas's name in the second verse is written smaller than the other letters. When we commit violence, even if justifiable, the yud in us, standing for the name of God, like Jan said, and for Yehudi, right, the first letter of the word Yehudi, which is Jew, is diminished thereby. So, right, so just let me stop there for a second. So according to our commentary, when we use violence in God's name, we are diminishing God's name, and we are diminishing the Jewish values in us. So that's a modern take on this understanding of why, and also what the rabbis would have said about why the yud is written smaller, and also why we broke the story and to wait a week for the reward. Was his action really justified? Is it deserving of a reward? So the yud, that's why the yud, and now it goes on, we're on the top right below the line. In verse 12, the letter vav in shalom in the Torah scroll is written with a break in its stem, like I said. This is interpreted homiletically, fancy word for midrash, to suggest that the sort of peace one achieves by destroying one's opponent will inevitably be flawed, incomplete peace. So peace doesn't come about. Perfect peace doesn't come about with a destruction of the enemy. Perfect peace comes about with people coming together, compromising together, and achieving peace together, right? So it's like the peace between Canada and America versus the peace between Egypt and Israel, right? So Egypt and Israel's peace, okay, you finally, Anwar Sadat said, enough of getting killed over here. All right, we'll reach a peace agreement, but it's what they call a cold peace, because it's not like people are, you don't have many, if any, joint academic, cultural activities happening between Egypt and Israel. You have even business dealings. You don't really want to publicize those business dealings if you're in Egypt with that you're undertaking with Israel. So anyway, let me just read one more paragraph and then we'll call it a day. Several commentators understand God's granting the priesthood to Pinchas. So now, if Pinchas is not viewed as such a hero by most rabbinic leaders, then why did he end up being the high priest? Right? If the rabbis say that this is not the person that we're supposed to hold up high in high esteem, then why does the Torah hold him in high esteem? So several commentators understand God's granting the priesthood to Pinchas and his descendants, not as a reward for his extremism, but as an antidote for it. He will have to cure himself of his violent temper if he is to function as a Kohen. I would add to this the understanding there's no spontaneity in being a priest in the temple. Everything goes according to script. And the act of spontaneity that happened in the Torah, Nadav and Avihu, Pinchas's uncles, his father Eleazar's brothers, there's Eleazar and Itamar, and then there's Nadav and Avihu. They brought strange fire. They went against the script, and they were struck down by God, right? Back in Leviticus chapter 10 or 11 in Leviticus has that story of act of spontaneity going against the script of the worship, you're struck down. So Pinchas, spontaneous, now can't be spontaneous ever again. That's one commentator. This will protect Pinchas from the destructive impulse within him, right? Or kind of channel the anger. You get to slaughter animals, slay their hides, burn them on the, stick a spit through it and put it on the altar. So maybe you can use your violence that way. Perhaps serving as a Kohen will give him ways of atoning for having taken 2 lives. A person is never the same after he has shed blood, no matter how justifiable the cause. So that's something else also that the rabbis teach us, right? So that in their day, the rabbis teaching, especially in the time of the Romans, I mean, just look at the punishment of crucifixion that the Romans invented. Romans were, and stories in the Talmud of rabbis who were tortured to death for teaching Torah publicly, right? They're flayed with iron combs and other hideous forms of torture. So if you're teaching within a society that so demeans life in that way, and you have gladiators, the Colosseum, all of that. So it kind of glorifies violence, and so it teaches that the rabbis are saying, despite living in that kind of society where violence is cherished, it's glorified, we rabbis are saying the opposite. We cherish life. We are sad when one drop of blood from one person is shed, and all life is sacred. So you can see why the rabbis then could add to their message, and that Pinchas then comes as a thorn in their side. Or, okay, what are we going to do about this? So it's on the question to ask, and what I'll leave you with is, were the Torah scrolls written this way with the smaller yud and a broken vav already in the time of the rabbis? Or did the rabbis mandate from now on the yud should be smaller and the vav should be broken? That is a question that we don't necessarily have the answer to, because the oldest scrolls we have go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they are 2,000 years old. So we don't know of scrolls before that whether the Yud and Pinchas and the Vav and Shalom were written that way, or did the rabbis say, this is how we're going to interject our thinking into the Torah scroll itself. That's possible that the rabbis did that. All right, folks, have a good rest of the day. Looking forward to reading this on Shabbat. We'll discuss some other things from this portion on Shabbat morning. I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Stay cool, stay safe, stay healthy. We have Minyan tonight at 7:30 for those who are interested. So long, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.